Right, so welcome to the first lecture of the third week of Philosophy 1500.02, Introduction to Logic Online. This week we're going to be talking about argument forms and the counterexample or countermodel method of proving invalidity. This first lecture is going to be on argument forms, right? And what we're going to do is see what the notion of an argument form is, right, and why it's important. So we'll look at a few examples, and then we'll look at a few exercises. Right, so let's get started. Right, so we're just going to start with what I'm going to call the big idea. Right, so the big idea is that arguments have the same form. Right, and we'll have to precisify what that idea means, but by the end of the lecture it should be fairly obvious. Right, so perhaps one thing that you've noticed so far, we've been looking at a lot of arguments, is that a lot of my arguments that we've been looking at have something in common with one another. Right, so consider the following two arguments. First argument, if it's raining, then we will go outside. It's raining, therefore we will go outside. Second argument, if it's snowing, then we will have hot chocolate. It's snowing, therefore we will have hot chocolate. Right, so before moving on, just take a second, try to identify what these arguments have in common, if anything. Right, so maybe pause me and think about it for a moment. Right, so one thing that they have in common, right, is that they both have two premises, right, and one conclusion, right, so they're an argument. Another thing they have in common is that the first statement of each, the first premise, is a conditional statement, that is an if-then statement. Another thing they have in common, right, is that the antecedent of the if-then statement, that is the first bit after if, right, in the first argument, it's the it is raining bit. In the second, it's the it is snowing bit. That bit reappears as the second premise, right? And another thing they have in common, right, is that the consequent of the first premise, the consequent of the conditional statement that is the first premise, right, reappears as the conclusion of the argument. So in the first argument, we will go outside is the consequent, right, and it's also the conclusion, right, and in the second argument, we will have hot chocolate is the consequent, and it's also the conclusion, right? So there's something similar about these arguments, or many things that are similar, in fact, right? They have the same sort of shape or form, right? So what we're getting at here is the idea of argumentative form, right? And we'll say that these two arguments have the same form. So let's try to make this more precise. Right, so in the next few slides, we're just going to be looking at the form of these arguments, right? So we've already walked through it very quickly, but let's try to make it more precise, or at least more careful, right? Or slower at the very least. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use color to find things that are in common among the arguments. So the first thing, right, the if and the thens are highlighted, right, in yellow, right? And you'll note that the first premise of both arguments, right, is a conditional statement. That is an if-then statement. Right, the next thing to notice, right, is that the antecedent of the first premise, that conditional statement in both arguments, reappears as the second premise. So in the first argument, it is raining, right, and in the second, it is snowing. Right, the next thing to notice, this time highlighted in blue, right, is that the consequent of the first premise in both arguments reappears as the conclusion. We will go outside, right, in the first argument, and we will have hot chocolate in the second. Good. Right, so those two arguments, they're highlighted in the same way. Right. So what I'm going to say is that they have the same form, or they share a form, or they share an argumentative form. Right. So here's what I've identified as the form of the argument. So if R, then O, R, O. Right. So maybe take a look back at those arguments, right, and see if you see this. But what we're going to say is that the two arguments are substitution instances of this form. That is, in both arguments, right, the R bit is replaced by the same sentence or same statement, and the O bit is replaced by the same statement or sentence, right? So in the first argument, if it is raining, right? So it is raining is the R, right? And we will go outside is O, right? And in the second, if it's snowing, right? It's snowing is R, and then we will have hot chocolate. We will have hot chocolate is O. Right, so the next idea, right, or the next example rather, right, we're going to be looking at these two arguments. So all doctors are educated people, all educated people are noble people, therefore all doctors are noble people. Second argument, all lawyers are avaricious, all avaricious people are vicious people, therefore all lawyers are vicious people. So note that I'm not endorsing these arguments, right, lest you be offended. But now's a time to pause this lecture and try to think about what these arguments have in common. You can use highlighters if you've printed this out, or just try to figure it out in your mind's eye, as it were. Right, so we're going to be looking at these arguments in more detail and doing the same thing we did last time. But one thing to note about these two arguments, right, and the two arguments we looked at previously, is that in this argument, what we're going to be like highlighting, right, are terms, right, whereas in the previous arguments what we highlighted were statements, right, like complete sentences. It's raining, or it's snowing, or we will have hot chocolate, or we will go outside, right? So here it will be doctors, educated people, noble people. Okay, so keep that in mind. So I hope that you took a moment to try to figure out what these arguments have in common. I hope that you see that they have something in common, but let's continue on. Right, so starting, what we should do when we're trying to figure out what the argument form is abstract away from the things that make the argument like a particular argument that it is. Right, so this will come with practice in identifying argument forms. But a good sort of rule of thumb, right, is if there are like complete sentences, right, remove those. And if there are words like all or are or none or some, right, take those. Right, so let's begin by highlighting all and are, right? So note that each sentence or each statement, each premise, each conclusion of these arguments has the form all, something, are, something, right? So that's depicted with the yellow highlighting. So first premise of the first argument, all doctors are educated people. Second premise, all educated people are noble people, and so on. Right, so next thing to do is to highlight the terms that are the same in both arguments. So you'll note that in the first argument, we've highlighted doctors in green, right? And that appears in the first sort of slot in the first premise and also in the first slot of the conclusion. Similarly for lawyers in the first premise of the second argument and lawyers for the conclusion of the second argument. Right, next we'll do the same thing for educated people, here highlighted in blue. Right, so educated people in sort of in the second slot, right, of the first premise of the first argument and is in the first slot of the second premise of the first argument. Similarly for avaricious people. Right, so a couple things to sort of note here. So one of them is that we're going to sort of be putting things together. So note that I didn't highlight educated and people separately, right? And I won't do that for noble people or vicious people either. The idea here is that we want to group together as much as we can, right, without getting in the way of words like all or are or none or some, right? And similarly for like if then and or not or but. All right, and then continuing on, we've highlighted in purple noble people and vicious people. And note that they're both in the sort of second slot of the all blank are blank construction in the second premise of the first argument and the conclusion of the first argument, and also in the second premise of the second argument and the conclusion of the second argument. So if you sort of squint, right, and look at the colors on the PowerPoint, you'll note that they're arranged or distributed in the same way in both arguments. All right, so take a moment to reflect on that. Right, so to determine the form of this argument, or of these arguments rather, since they have the same form, as depicted by the distribution of colors, right, we'll remove the things that make the argument sort of particular, right? So we'll remove doctors and lawyers and vicious people and avaricious people, noble people. And we're left with something like this, substituting in variables. So D and E and N here are variables that stand for like terms, right? We're left with all D are E, all E are N, therefore all D are N. Right, so the two arguments that we were talking about, right, and we've been going through and highlighting, right, these are substitution instances of this form here. All D are E, all E are N, therefore all D are N. One thing to note is that there's no particular reason, at least that I can recall at the moment, why I used D and E and N, right? We could have used any other letter, right? So all A are B, all B are C, therefore all A are C, right? Just so long as we substitute the letters or use the variables uniformly, right? So every place where there's a D, right, that could have been an A, and every place there's an E, that could have been a B, and every place there's an N, that could have been a C, right? And those would still be arguments of the same form. Right, so what's the upshot of all of this? I said it was a big idea. It's this, right? So arguments with the same form are either all valid or all invalid. You can read the bit in parentheses to yourself. It's not important. Yeah. So anyway, what this means, right, is that if we know that one argument, right, is invalid, say, and we have an argument with that same form, right, we determine that it has the same form as the invalid argument, then we know that that other argument is invalid, right? If we know that the first argument is invalid, and we have a second argument and it has the same form, right, then we know that it's invalid as well, right? And similarly, if we know of one argument that it's valid, then for any other argument with the same form, right, same argumentative form, it will also be valid. All right, so let's do another example. This time, I'm not going to give you two arguments, right, and you have to figure out what they have in common. Rather, we're just going to have one argument, right, and I want you to figure out what the form of the argument is. So what we're going to be doing here is trying to figure out whether or not this argument is valid or invalid, right? So here's the argument. All dogs are furry. All chinchillas are furry. Therefore, all dogs are chinchillas. Suppose that the premises are true. Right, does the conclusion follow? Well, suppose it's true that all dogs are furry and that all chinchillas are furry. Does it follow that all dogs are chinchillas? Well, surely not, right? So what does that mean? Well, the premises could be true and the conclusion false at the same time, right? So the argument would be, that's right, invalid, right? So remember, an argument is valid if and only if it's not possible for its premises to be true and its conclusion false at the same time. And an argument's invalid if and only if it's not valid, right? So it's possible for the premises of this argument to be true while its conclusion is false at the same time, right? So it's not valid, so it's invalid. Okay. So what is the form of this argument? Right, so I want you to figure that out. But remember, we're going to keep words like all and are right there, right? And every time we see an instance of a particular term or sentence like dog, right, we'll remove that and put a variable in. Right, so pause, right, write down what you come up with, and then turn me back on and we'll move on to the next slide and you'll see what you should have come up with. Right, so here's what I think you should have come up with. Something like this. And again, the particular letters don't matter just so long as they're uniformly placed. Right, so I have all D are F, all C are F, therefore all D are C. Right, so again, in this case at least, I've chosen D for dog and F for furry and C for chinchillas. right? So note how the C's and the D's and the F's are distributed throughout the argument, right? Wherever chinchilla appeared, a C now appears. Wherever dogs appeared, D now appears. And wherever furry appeared, F now appears, right? So this is the form of that argument. So here's another argument. Now, I've sort of given away what the answer here is, but try to figure out whether or not this is a substitution instance of that very form that we just looked at. Well, note that I've told you that it is, right? So all dragons are fiery, all campfires are fiery, therefore all dragons are campfires. Suppose you wanted to know whether or not this argument was valid or invalid. And then you look and you find, well, what's its form? Well, it's all D are F, all C are F, therefore all D are C, right? Or you could have said something like all X are Y, all Z are Y, therefore all X are Z, I think I used for campfires. It doesn't quite matter, or again, rather, it doesn't matter at all what variables you use, just so long as you use them uniformly. Right, so if I chose X for dragons and Y for fiery and Z for campfires, right, you could write all X are Y and all Z are Y, therefore all X are Z, right, and that would be the same form as all D are F, all C are F, therefore all D are C, right. So the important point, circling back, right, is that this argument is a substitution instance of that same form, right, which we already established was invalid, right? So this argument is also invalid.